Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the incredible difficulty that Western countries that are recipients of vast numbers of illegals, whether it's people arriving illegally or overstaying their visas or whatever, but vast numbers of illegals, and they seem to have almost a 99.9% inability to deport criminal aliens or aliens generally, no matter what the circumstances. Now, I've sort of pondered this and there's a few issues as to why, but I've noticed that they seem to have much less of a problem in deporting white people. So a while ago there was I'm just looking at one case now. Here's a white guy who's come from some European country, and he came with his folks when he was a kid, and he became an Australian citizen, and but he committed some crimes, and one of the major crime that seemed to particularly get him into trouble is he was possibly harassed by police. I don't know, but anyway, he was. And ended up in an altercation where there was actually a punch up where he ended up having a punch up with two police officers, and that was treated quite reasonably, by the way. It was treated seriously by the court, and I think he got a prison term of 18 months or something for it, But when that prison term was over, they went to deport him. Now, he argued that all his family lived in Australia, so why should he be deported? And but the government was able to put forward the argument quite successfully, by the way, in the court, that he was divorced, he was estranged from his children, or so they argued, and he didn't have sufficient contact with things like brothers and sisters and so on. So therefore, he had no connections, as in social connections, in Australia, and therefore he was to be evicted. So he was deported, rather. And he was. And I was surprised how sort of quickly that was done. There was no legal aid rushing to his defence. There was no human rights lawyers flocking to his side, because he was a straight white male, and so that was it. He was left on his own. If he couldn't afford to pay for his legal costs, and having been 18 months in prison, he was hardly a wealthy man. So that was it. He was deported, and I was surprised at how quickly and easy it was for them to do that. And I've looked at a few other cases where it's white people, and they seem to have no problem deporting white people. Now, when they want to deport a brown or black person, suddenly the situation changes. When the white guy was under deportation, he had to prove that they shouldn't deport him. But when the brown and the black person, or brown or the black person who's arrived illegally and or committed crimes more serious than getting in a punch up with police, drug dealing and murder and all sorts of things, rape, and the list goes on. When a black or brown person is up for it, then it's quite different. There's an army of NGO-funded lawyers representing the guy. So even he's penniless, he's got this battery of lawyers representing, filing all the documents for him, representing him in court, doing the appeals, even paying for his transport to and from the court. Buying, making sure he appears presentably in the court, all this sort of stuff. This is all laid on. It's like lavishly funded from these NGOs, all of whom are getting tax-exempt status. So indirectly, the taxpayers funding this. Now, if NGOs don't buy into it, then the government incredibly decides that they'll use the Australian legal aid system, which is meant to be for Australian citizens, but they'll use the Australian legal aid system to give this illegal alien criminal, to give him or her free legal representation. Now, some of these bills, in legal bills, have come to over $500,000, representing appeal after appeal and so on, that these people get. So the government is funding all the lawyers to argue against it, which it seems astonishing. I mean, why didn't the white guy get that sort of thing, or why don't any of the white guys get that sort of legal aid and that sort of financial support? Why are the NGOs only going to fund and back up the black and brown criminals? I just don't get that. But no one seems to have a problem with it. In fact, if anything, they're seen as virtuous, that the straight white males are left to fend for themselves. Who cares? But here's this black criminal who's been a drug dealer and a rapist, and involved in bashings. They're here illegally anyway, that sort of stuff. Oh no, they have to get all the support. I just don't get that. But anyway, that's kind of how it is. But looking at the other thing that sort of struck me, one of the other things that struck me was how, whereas the white guy had to take, who was being deported or threatened with deportation, he had to accept the burden of proof. He had to prove why he shouldn't be. The brown people don't. The burden of proof then reverses. The government has to prove why this person should be deported. And the court is stacked with activists who are extremely pro the illegal aliens. Now, why would you stack a tribunal or a court with those sort of people who are extreme activists in one direction? Why would you do that if you didn't want a particular outcome? Now, centre-right governments, I mean, they're all globalist controlled, but centre-right governments appoint rabid activists to sit on these panels and these courts. Why would you do that if you didn't want the outcome to, and these people very reliably and very dependably rule in favour of these black and brown criminals and illegals. But the government reverses the burden of proof on itself. So if Abdul or somebody says, well, I'm in danger if I go back, I'm really gay, and if I go back, they'll kill me. Go back to wherever he came from, they'll kill me. So you can't send me back because I'm in danger. Now, Abdul doesn't have to prove he's gay. He doesn't have to prove he'd be killed. He doesn't have to prove. So really the burden, Abdul only needs to allege it, just assert that's the situation. Then it's the government's job to prove Abdul wrong. Now, how can you prove something when Abdul comes from a village that hasn't even got a telephone? So nobody speaks English there anyway. How can you satisfy that burden of proof? That's 100% now on the government to say, well, we can prove conclusively and absolutely that A, Abdul is not gay, and B, Abdul's not in danger. Now, it turns out when the court hearing's over, Abdul then suddenly decides he's not gay anymore, wants to bring his wife and children from wherever. But then there's no appeal. The government doesn't go, hey, this guy committed grand perjury in court, so now we'll have another hearing and now we'll evict him. They don't do that. So there's nobody's really concerned over the perjury, concerned over the misrepresentation. Abdul only needs to assert it, and then the government takes 100% of the burden of proof to disprove it. And when you're looking at a third world sort of country with no sophisticated legal system or legal structure or record keeping or legal depositions and documents you can access, it's almost impossible to meet that burden of proof. If it's a first world country, of course you can, in all probability, meet that burden of proof. But in these third world countries, you can't. Maybe if someone is a white collar worker in the downtown area of the biggest city or something, maybe then you could. But anyone else, it's almost impossible to meet that burden of proof. Now, the government knows this. Western governments know this. So they're deliberately placing upon themselves a burden of proof that they can't meet. So by default or by extension, the deportation attempt fails. Now, another aspect of it is because the government gives so much leeway to these people to allow them, and the NGOs to fund them and to fund the appeals, and if they do lose a case, sometimes they do lose the attempt at staying, and the deportation order is meant to go ahead. But then very generous allowance of appeals and generous funding from NGOs or legal aid is then permitted for reasons I don't understand. Why would you allow an activist NGO who's supposed to be a charity? Why would you allow them to pay for this person's legal fee and provide armies of lawyers? I mean, isn't that in itself a perversion of the justice system? Why don't the white people and the white guys who are subject to deportation, why can't they get that same sort of support? Shouldn't that support be given equally to all people under the threat of deportation? Why is it only certain categories or races or people? So, I mean, that in itself should be, in my view, investigated. But the government sometimes just rolls over and says, "No, this case is too expensive. We've already spent, $1 million, for example, $1 million on fighting this guy. So it's too expensive. We'll just let him stay." So we've got the taxpayer funding both sides of this legal stash, and so they're claiming, "Well, it cost $2 million now." So here's an illiterate peasant from a third world country that somehow, who won't make $2 million in their lifetime, not even close, who's somehow permitted to attract $2 million of legal fees, making some lawyers very rich, arguing a case that has no merit anyway. So when we go through this, it's corrupt, in my view. It's corrupt to the core in its determination. It wants to not deport people. So there's some spurious thing. I mean, here's a guy who's committed, serial rape over a number of years from a third world country, and he's up for deportation, but he's estranged from his family and all this sort of stuff. But he's arguing his human rights. So, he has this vague human right to have a family life, and therefore the deportation orders, and he wins the case. Then the activist judge, that's right, human rights, yeah, okay, well, you don't have to be deported. All that criminality and all that, who cares, hey, so you can't speak a word of English. I mean, it doesn't matter, these sorts of things. So this sort of, again, is shot through with activists, this whole thing. But if it needs, I think it urgently needs a reset. The burden of proof that needs to be, I think, on the person who's not that the government doesn't have to bring its case, it does, but the burden of proof needs to be on the person to be deported, or certainly the burden of proof in due legal process needs to be equally distributed, not 100% burden of proof on the government, or for that matter 100% on the person to be deported. So proper standards of justice, not ideological, insane social engineering justice to be applied. And that anybody who's subject to deportation order receives exactly the same funding as anyone else. Just because you're an illiterate peasant third world country doesn't mean you get $2 million worth of funding. But the white guy, the straight white guy who's penniless anyway, doesn't get a cent of funding. That's not how justice is supposed to work, or not in my view at least. Now, if these basic sort of reforms would have been made put through, then many deportations would take place, and this would be I think this would be a just and worthwhile thing. When people arrive illegally or commit crimes or these sort of things, then they should be subject to deportation. I don't mean crimes of spitting on the sidewalk or something, but they should be subject to deportation, and that's only fair and reasonable in my view. But the system is very broke, but it's intended to be broke because the globalists don't want to deport these people. They want these people here as much as anything, because it degrades white society and destabilizes white society, which again is a globalist objective. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.